Are you familiar with the study of graphology?
I've never given it any serious thought, no.
The psychological analysis of handwriting.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I've been quite surprised to see some of the responses to my previous video. Well, it was really not viewed by very many, but some of those responses were quite interesting. From the notion that handwriting analysis is a pseudoscience that has no place in an investigation.
You're out of your mind.
Or in true crime, to a few saying, okay, but let's get a real expert in because clearly you know nothing. Well, firstly, to say handwriting analysis is useless in true crime, well, that's a real whopper. Don't we deal with text messages all the time? I've dealt with cases where the use of emoticons is analyzed in order to decide whether the person really sent certain text messages themselves or whether they were staged. Were they in the habit of sending certain emoticons or not? That came up with Kelsey Beresford's phone in the Patrick Frazee case, and it may come up in the Morphew case as well. So if we're examining emoticon use and things like verbiage and statement analysis in text messages, which we are all the time, to determine the author of a text, and then we also get a sense, we get a kind of the sense of the kind of person we are dealing with through these texts, right? You have that also in the Oscar Pistorius case. Well, why wouldn't we look at handwriting to determine the type of author of a text as well? And so not only is the content of text messages important and the timing important, but here in Heuermann's 2-page handwritten letter, we actually get a sense of the personality and the psychology of the writer through the myriad of choices that go into handwriting. It really is quite fascinating. How big is it? How small is it? How consistent are the letters? Do they lean forward? Do they lean backwards? Are they neutral, or do they lean forward and backward? Does the writing dip below the lines or violate ceilings? What about the spacing in terms of the right margin? How many words are crossed out? Also, simple spelling mistakes, which is an issue smartphones can correct, but it gives you an artificial sense of the author. Well, these errors remain behind in the handwriting, and they give us a sense of the educational level or intelligence of a potential suspect.
Will you let me finish? Can you let me finish?
Secondly, after writing books for around 10 years and dealing with handwriting in virtually all of them, I would say I've developed an expertise both in educating myself in terms of specific traits that can be extrapolated from letters, and there are certain letters that give certain things away more than others. A lot of the O's, whether the O is closed or not, A, the tail of the D, the letter T, how an I is dotted, the capital signatures, and so on and so on. And so I feel, developed my own expertise beyond what I've learned from, let's call it classic handwriting analysis. So these are my own intuitions and intuitive analysis.
It's the only argument I need, Sean!
How scientific is it? Well, that's an important question to ask. How subjective is it? Also important question to ask. Obviously, it's a little bit of both. And I think there's an art to getting it right, just as there's an art in reading the effect of a perpetrator or would-be perpetrator correctly and accurately. In this analysis, I want to share some of my personal observations, which I really left out of part 1. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So the first thing I want to mention is how the letters crash into one another. A simple thing like the size of words and letters and how they are spaced apart, right? And this applies to you as well. It reveals a great deal about how we see ourselves in the context of society, how much space we place between one letter and another letter, but also between one word and another word, indicates our comfort levels also with other people around us. What level of closeness are we comfortable with? In terms of this, it's interesting not only how close Heuermann's words are to each other, but also the individual letters. There's also some degree of variability in this area. Notice how spaced out the words and letters, being only a month, are relative to the surrounding script. Now, if you want to know what stands out to me, it's the word comfort with a P, not only spelled incorrectly, but the letters P and F actually collide into one another, and arguably so do the next two letters, the O and the R as well. And if that was a singular instance, you might be right to dismiss it. If that was the only time you saw that sort of thing taking place, it would be okay not to make too much of a big deal about it. Now, given how early in the letter this artifact arises, the first paragraph, and actually in the first 3 lines, one can't really dismiss it as easily as and conveniently as one might want to. You might want to dismiss it as the author simply growing tired that the legibility of his handwriting is degrading as the letter goes on. But the issue is that there are other instances of this as well, which we'll touch on in a moment. Now, the second artifact worth mentioning occurs in the same line, in fact, just prior to comfort, where the tail of the Y in your, that's in the line above, acts as a sort of dagger, downward dagger, and the letters L and P in the word help below that have to sort of make space for this long downward stroke of the Y. Now, jam together words and pieces of letters violating the spaces of other letters and words suggests an intrusive personality. Now, in terms of what we know about the Long Island serial killer suspect, we know he did get under people's skin at work, where he constantly invited them to go hunting with him. And someone also mentioned thinking he was watching them from outside the building. Now, obviously, where a serial killer is trying to select just the right victims, perhaps from a pool of prostitutes, there is going to be a certain amount of intruding into their privacy, wanting to know who they are, what their habits are, how close their relationships are with family. All of that's going to play into the calculus of selecting a victim. Bringing prostitutes home and murdering them, if that is what happened here, well, it's also a particular type of intrusion, think about it, into the sanctity of the family home. And you're seeing this intrusion going on within the letters and words of his own letter. Now, in the case of a sexual killer, intrusion is also very much part of the psychology, where there is intrusion in a sexual sense, and then also in a violent sense, where, for example, one places some kind of object into the body with the intention of destroying it. In other words, it's a destructive aspect to this person. And aren't you seeing some of that violence in the handwriting itself? Now, number 2, spelling mistakes. In the Ramsey ransom note, which I've studied at length, there are at least 2 spelling mistakes. Well, there are 2 spelling mistakes. But I believe these mistakes were made intentionally to suggest, to mislead the analyst into thinking that the writer was uneducated, when really the opposite was true. In this case, in the Heuermann letter, although it's possible the spelling mistakes are deliberate as well, I personally believe many people misspell the word advice. Instead of with a C, with a S. Advise. Now, for a meticulous architect working in Manhattan, it's surprising to me that Heuermann misspells the words that he misspells, because surely the job of an architect is to provide advice and to advise. And the fact that he can't differentiate between these words is interesting. And this suggests that he's not the master of intelligence that he seems to be. And I know many serial killers are mischaracterized and even idolized by some for their apparent super intelligence. Well, this is a sign that Heuermann is really quite normal, quite average on the intelligence scale. Now on to the next one. Lower caps mixed with all caps. Using all caps has to do with ego, and one really does have a sense that Heuermann is an egotist. By the way, if you're listening to this analysis and applying it to yourself, then you've really lost the plot, because this isn't about your handwriting, and it's not about your psychology, it's about Heuermann, right? So please don't do that. Please don't go, oh, what does that say about me? If you'd like to do your own handwriting analysis, do it, but do it on your own time. This is not about you, it's about Heuermann. Now, in the above samples, the word sounds is a capital S, and both D's in day to day are capitalized as well. Heuermann seems to want to give his handwriting emphasis. The letter F in the first word of his letter first towers over the rest, alongside the S in say, that's the first line, and the T in thank, also in the first line. Now, I've made the case in the past that Heuermann thinks very highly of himself, or he wants to, hence the address on Fifth Avenue. But the reality is he was living a rather small life in a rather small house. And I think each trip to and from Manhattan became occasionally a pride-swallowing siege. And I've made that trip myself. I've made the trip literally from the Massapequa Park station to the station where he came out and then walked to his office. And I do want to share what that commute felt like and looked like and was like. I'll do that in a separate video. And so, I think he was seeing a world he aspired to be part of, only to find himself apart from it. And again, I think one's really got to make that trip from the suburbs, the distant suburbs, places like Massapequa, to the center of Manhattan, and that's what Midtown is, and get a sense of the change in the landscape, the change in the value of the fabric of society, the change in the type of people you get in the one location compared to the other location. And what would it be like moving endlessly from the one to the other, and from the other back from A back to B, right? And could his ego stand that? I'm not sure if many egos would. I'm not sure if my ego could stand that. I'm certainly saying that the average person would feel the sort of tug of war, that which place would you rather be in? Which place would you rather be associated with? Now, incidentally, I have located exactly where Heuermann is in this Google Street View photograph. And again, this comes from going to the area and becoming quite familiar with it. Where he is he's standing virtually right outside his office. Look to the left and you'll see a sort of yellow or gold framed square entrance. That's the entrance to his office. The number 385 is slightly obscured by a red sign. And so if you look at these photos I've taken, photos and video of the entrance up close, I think you get a better sense not only of the real context with the Empire State Building in the background, but also and the view from across the street, but also a sense of Heuermann himself, just in terms of this juxtaposition. Incidentally, the green trash can on the other side of the street, basically diagonally right in front of his office at 385 Fifth Avenue, that's not in this image, it's in this image. Well, that is the trash can where the cops fished out a pizza box and retrieved his DNA from a leftover pizza crust. I also think saying that it is pointless trying to get anything from handwriting, it's almost like saying, well, it would be pointless trying to get anything out of that pizza box that he threw in the trash. Well, look what they did find, DNA. And he was actually convicted based on DNA. And so why wasn't his wife charged? And so why wasn't his wife charged based on, I think, 3 times as much DNA? And I think that is a subject worthy of analysis, which we'll maybe do in a follow-up episode. Now, what I want you to do is, and you can only do this if you've been following what I've been saying all along. If you look at the handwriting, if you accept that we're dealing with a person with ego issues, he can't decide how big to make his letters. The letter I changes constantly, and we'll deal with that in a bit more detail in a moment. But try to imagine a man with ego issues working in a colorful environment like this, like Manhattan, where there are so many young and beautiful and successful people and these impressive structures surrounding them. And is that enough to clothe and to kind of give kind of an ordinary man a sense of that same success, that same beauty, that same youth, that same impressiveness? Because bear in mind, he ends up going home to this. And isn't that how he really sees himself and how he really knows himself? That brings us to the fourth observation, cruelty. Oh, aren't we seeing cruelty and severity in the handwriting, specifically in the letter T? Now, I don't know if there is. I'm saying, could there be? If there is cruelty or capriciousness, where does it come from? Well, it comes from a lifetime, perhaps, of not living the sort of fairy tale life one feels one deserves. One feels hard done by because you're seeing people around you living a fairy tale, and for some reason, it's just bypassing you. It's just you're not getting onto that same train. You're not able to catch that train. It comes from decades of feeling crushed in, while surrounded by others who are breaking out and living their lives on the largest possible scale. You know, they're living their lives in a blaze of glory. Your life is simply kind of paddling forward. And I think it's very important not just to see Heuermann's life on its own terms, which may be very normal in a normal situation, but we're not dealing with a normal situation, we're dealing with New York. We're dealing with an area which is, I think, the second most expensive city in the world. And it is thus a place where extremely well-heeled, wealthy, successful, and those sort of individuals live. And so can one truly feel that you belong in that society? I mean, do you even have the finances to feel comfortable and that you are part of this fabric of society, this upper echelon? Well, it's one thing to think that you belong, it's another thing to actually belong, right, in an authentic sense. In any event, if all of this is true, and I mean it's just a theory I've got, is there severity anywhere in the handwriting? Is this sense of tension kind of bleeding through in the handwriting? Well, besides those idiosyncrasies highlighted in the first point, I see signs of cruelty in particular in the letter T. Consider the enormous dash used in the T in comment, in the word, when he uses the word comment. There's a huge strike through, a very long line that basically starts almost halfway across the M, covers the entire letter E as well as the entire letter N, and even reaches into the territory, if that's the word, of the next word. It basically touches on that area of the next word. That's a huge line that is applied to this particular word, right? And then also look at the tiny. Now again, you need to look at something that stands out and contrast it with something that's the opposite. And so you look at the tiny I almost directly above it. The I doesn't even have a dot above it. The I itself is almost just a dot itself. And what we are seeing are certain letters that appear huge and imposing, like some of the buildings in Manhattan. while others are tiny. This inconsistency suggests someone with unsettled ego problems at work, at home, and or in the bedroom. Let's go on now to number 5, double T. This is the first time I think I've ever seen this. Heuermann has a tendency to make his T's gigantic. I've already said that. But the thing is, we know that. But what's also weird is how he will use the same stroke. There's also this enormous slash where he writes the word important. And that slash goes over the R, goes through the first T, goes right over the letter A and N, onto the second T, and then continues to overhang all the way to the next word. It goes again into the territory of the W of that next word, right? And this linking of the T stroke seems to me to be about forced intrusiveness, forcing his way, right, in terms of how the words and the letters force themselves onto one another and are forced to be linked in certain ways, seems to have a parallel in reality. Another example is where both T letters occur side by side, for example, in the word letter, L-E-T-T-E-R. And what does Heuermann do? He links them with now not a long T, but a kind of looks like a letter C. And he does it many times. It's not a one-off. It's not random. Okay, so to reiterate, instead of using a double strike through, he uses the letter C or a kind of squiggle to cross two T's in one stroke. Now, I can't say for sure what this means. You could say it's someone who's very efficient, someone who is impatient or something like that. I know when I write the word letter or any word with two T's, each T gets its own line. I don't know about you. Maybe you can get a piece of paper and a pen and try it out. Write a few words like petite and tattle and settle and metal, that's M-E-T-T-L-E, and see how you would write it. And I wouldn't call giving each T its own little cap, I wouldn't say that is being meticulous. I'd say it's normal. It's natural attention to detail. It's giving each letter its due. So to not do that seems to me about a disposable attitude to some of the letters, as if he doesn't have time to cross each and every T. Well, of course he has time. He's in jail. And I think there may be a parallel. I feel that there may be a parallel in this attitude to crossing T's as there is in some letters crushing or cutting into one another. This, added to the egotistical all caps and the variation in letters from minuscule to colossal, speaks to me about an intrusive person and more forceful, someone who's becoming more and more forceful on those around him. Number 6, the letter I. The letter I is a very important letter, especially the capital letter I, that's a self-referencing letter. I think it's strange, given the way Heuermann executes his T's, that his eyes don't resemble a pillar with a pedestal and a hat. You would think that there'd be some resemblance between the T's and the I. Instead, his eyes have a loop and a kind of a tail. I haven't seen that very often, although I have to admit one doesn't see handwriting as much these days as in the past. And this is only my opinion, but given the above points, it's difficult not to see something unnecessarily twisted about his self-referencing I.
It's the only argument I need, Sean!
So the I invariably tilts or slants backward, and unsurprisingly is also invariably a tall, self-important letter. The loop, just as the loop on Heuermann, not on Heuermann, on the letters H that he uses, may be a reference to his meticulous and creative nature or a need for grandiosity. Sometimes the self-referencing I is small. I wouldn't say small, but not. Sometimes it's very big and sometimes it's smaller. And so perhaps sometimes that grandiosity is suppressed. In the above sample, the letter I and the small letter D look similar. We see the same thing when he writes, I will admit. Consider the size of the letter H and the word admit, and the relative smallness of the backward-leaning I. His I also seems to be the most backward letter of them all. That, I think, is a major insight. All letters are neutral or slightly forward-tilting, but the I is not. Do you notice that? Look again. It's also interesting how often the bottom of the I's tail seems to cut into the line below it. In the above sample, the tail cuts under the line, almost like a J 3 consecutive times. The last I in the sample is the most crooked of all, almost resembling a backward C or G. Perhaps that is the best clue that his handwriting affords, and that that in the maelstrom of Manhattan, a place that is a jazz of dizzying skyscrapers and crazy towers dueling for top spot in the sun, he perceives himself moving backwards and falling behind. And I must say, I don't think you can do proper handwriting analysis or statement analysis or even any kind of analysis in true crime without knowing quite a lot about the individual, about where they live, about their environment, about their relationships. Otherwise, you forced to be projecting all of your own knowledge about your own situation, your environment, your culture onto that person. And so I think what I've done here, one does need to do. You need to go into that person's environment. One needs to look at that person's handwriting and try to intuit who that person was. What was their world? What was it like to be in their world, right? What is it like to step into their shoes? And the only way to do that is to step out of your own.
Will you let me finish? Can you let me finish?
Is that your only argument?
It's the only argument I need, Sean!
In a world that is racing forward, even if you're moving forward, it may feel as if you're falling further and further behind relative to everyone else. Wasn't that the world that Rex Heuermann was living in? Does that make sense? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.